Welcome back to True Asian Nightmare. I'm Kay, and I'm so glad you're here. If today left you feeling drained, it's time to set all those heavy thoughts aside. You don't have to carry that weight into the dark. Just sink into your bed, loosen your grip on the day, and let these true scary stories carry you away from the stress. As you settle in, hitting the like button and subscribing with the bell on really helps the channel grow. Doing that ensures there will always be another nightmare waiting for you every other night. I'd love to read in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what the time is in your part of the world. It's always so fascinating to see how many of us are sharing the quiet of the night together. I also want to say a quick thank you to Dana Claycomb 3119 for being the first person to comment on the last video. Now, just let your eyes slowly close, let the paranormal take over, and let's begin our first tale. First love. Screw first love. Seriously. People on the internet love to romanticize the whole innocent first love nonsense, but nobody tells you that your first love can sometimes be a one-way ticket straight to hell. For my best friend Daisy, her first love was pure decay. It was crippling debt and getting kicked to the curb like a stray dog. I was the one who had to pick her up off the floor. I was the one who patched her back together. But those absolute toxic leeches, bro, they do not ever let go of their prey. Even after that creep got his skull crushed under the wheels of a truck, he still dragged his rotting spirit back to claim the rest of her life. I really need you guys to understand the history here, because otherwise you are going to think my friend is just insane. I am Tessa, and I have always been the mom of the friend group. About 10 years ago, I was living in this incredibly cramped studio apartment on the edge of the city. It was the kind of cheap place where the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbor breathing, and the summer heat would just bake you alive inside. Daisy lived down the street back then. She was only 16 at the time, and I was in my early 20s. She was incredibly naive and sweet, and she had just started talking to this guy named Derek. Derek was 17, and he was the absolute textbook definition of a bad news street racer boy. He had the spiked hair and the loud modified bike, and he always smelled like cheap cologne and exhaust fumes. I warned her about him from day one. I explicitly told her to keep her guard up and make him chase her, but she was completely blinded by her first real crush. Within a few months, she gave him everything, including her virginity. Things got weird really fast after that. Daisy had dropped out of school to work these grueling shifts at a local boba tea shop. She was on her feet all day, carrying heavy ice buckets and wiping down sticky tables. A normal teenager making that kind of money should have been buying cute clothes, or at least a new phone screen. But her clothes were always frayed, and her shoes were literally falling apart. I cornered her one afternoon and demanded to know where all her money was going. She completely broke down and confessed that Derek was constantly broke. First his phone broke, so she bought him a new one. Then his bike broke down, so she bought him a gold ring to pawn. I was so mad, I could barely see straight. I told her it was not her job to fund his life, but she just kept making excuses about how hard his life was. It peaked a few weeks later. This was back when predatory loan apps were just starting to ruin lives. Daisy actually used her own ID to take out a high-interest black market cash loan just to buy Derek a brand new expensive motorcycle. It was roughly $400, which was an absolute fortune for a teenager working minimum wage back then. 3 days later, he dumped her. He got the bike, and he completely cut contact. I found out later that even Derek's own mother had secretly met up with Daisy to warn her. His mom was a genuinely good woman, and she sat Daisy down and told her point blank that her son was a cheating user and that Daisy needed to run away, but Daisy was too deep in denial. The afternoon of the breakup, I was chilling in my hot apartment when Daisy burst through my door. She was sobbing so hard she was choking on her own spit. In her trembling hands, she was clutching this black plastic grocery bag. She kept screaming that she wanted to die. I ripped the bag out of her hands and looked inside. It was a full bottle of toxic weed killer. She had bought it to end her own life, right there on my floor, because the pain of being betrayed after she had literally sold her soul and taken out high-interest loans just to buy him that bike, was too much to handle. The smell of the harsh chemicals was already leaking through the plastic cap and burning my nose. I tackled her to the floor and held her down while she completely lost her mind. I practically forced her to move into my apartment after that. I spent an entire year monitoring her and working extra shifts to help her pay off that massive loan shark debt so they would not come break her legs. I saved her life. I really did. Fast forward 4 years. Daisy had finally healed. She met a really great guy named Preston. Preston came from money, and he treated her like an absolute queen. They got married, and they had a beautiful baby boy named Toby. Everything was perfect, and the nightmare of her teenage years was supposed to be dead and buried. Then one random Tuesday afternoon, she showed up at my apartment carrying little Toby. I was living in a slightly better place by then, but still alone. As soon as I opened the door, I saw that her eyes were bloodshot. I immediately asked her if she and Preston were fighting. She shook her head and whispered that her old friends just messaged her about Derek. Apparently, he had been in a massive illegal street race and crashed his bike. He was currently in the ICU on life support. She asked me to watch Toby because she wanted to go to the hospital to see him. I completely lost my mind on her. I asked her what the actual hell was wrong with her and why she would ever care about a guy who ruined her teenage years. She begged me and said she felt this bizarre heavy pull in her chest that she could not explain. She also used the ultimate guilt trip by saying she really wanted to check on Derek's mom because the mom had always been so kind to her. I reluctantly agreed and took the baby. She came back 2 hours later, looking completely traumatized. She described his injuries to me, and it made my stomach churn. She said the swelling in his brain was so severe that his head looked like a grotesque alien balloon stretching his skin until it was shiny and purple. He died that same night. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was so wrong. Daisy went completely off the rails. Over the next 3 days, she continuously dropped her baby off at my place and secretly attended every single funeral ritual for Derek. She was crying and greeting guests like she was the grieving widow. People at the funeral were literally whispering behind her back about how pathetic she was for clinging to a guy she dated for a few months 4 years ago. Of course, Preston found out. Some mutual friends posted photos of the funeral on Facebook, and he saw his wife standing right next to the coffin. He was furious. They had a massive screaming match, and Preston essentially kicked her out to cool off. Daisy packed a bag and brought Toby over to my apartment to crash for a few days. And the most ironic part? She was literally using her rich husband's money to hide out at my place. She was ordering expensive hot pot and whole roast chickens for dinner every single night, and even bought us brand new blankets and soap like it was a vacation. The first night she stayed with me was totally normal. We just laid on my new mattress on the floor with Toby sleeping between us. But the second night is when my reality started to crack. It was maybe past 2 a.m. or something when I woke up to this weird mumbling sound. I rolled over and saw Daisy staring at the blank wall. At first I thought she was just sleep-talking, but the tone of her voice was completely conscious. She was cycling through extreme emotions. 1 second she was sobbing and asking him if he was in pain. The next second she was giggling this breathy, flirty laugh and asking him where he wanted to take her. Then her voice dropped into this distressed whisper, telling him that she could not go with him because she had a husband and a baby now. Then she literally smiled and whispered that she would just go with him for a little bit. I was so freaked out, I violently shook her shoulder. She snapped awake and looked at me, all dazed. I demanded to know who she was talking to. She rubbed her eyes and casually told me that she was dreaming about Derek. She pointed to the empty space right by my bedroom door and said he was just standing right there. She told me he was apologizing for the past and begging her to come look at the new house he just bought. I felt all the blood drain from my face. I told her straight up that this was a leeching spirit. In our culture, when a dead soul forcibly tries to resume a romantic contract with a living person, it is incredibly dangerous. It means the spirit is trying to drag you down to the grave to be with them. Daisy just rolled her eyes at me. She brushed it off as a simple stress dream and told me I was being overly dramatic, but her actions the next day proved she was completely losing her grip on sanity. Preston was still giving her a generous allowance, despite their fight, so she went to the supermarket. I came home from my shift and found her unpacking groceries. She bought all the fresh ingredients to make sweet and sour fish soup. I asked her what the occasion was, because we never cooked anything that complicated. She calmly looked me dead in the eyes and said she was cooking it for Derek. I literally froze in my tracks. I asked her to repeat herself. She told me that in her dream, Derek said it was cold where he was, and he really missed the fish soup she used to make him when they were teenagers. I watched in absolute horror as my married friend cooked a massive pot of soup, carried it out to the dirty curb of the intersection outside my apartment, lit 3 sticks of incense, and offered it to a dead man. The smell of the hot sour broth, mixing with the humid city air, made me want to throw up. When I confronted her about it, she immediately went into a defensive denial loop. She desperately tried to convince me that she only loved Preston and that she was just doing a nice gesture out of pity. She said the dead need to eat too, and it was harmless, but the internal gaslighting did not stop there. The next evening, I found a giant plastic bag hidden under her jacket. I ripped it open and found stacks of spiritual paper offerings. It was an entire paper mansion, a paper luxury car, a paper tuxedo, and a paper Rolex watch. I threw the bag on the floor and asked her if she had completely lost her mind. She scrambled to pick them up and told me it only cost like $15. She said Derek promised to take care of her in the afterlife, and he needed these things to build their new life together. I grabbed her by the shoulders and screamed at her. I told her she was a married woman with a child, and she was actively inviting a demon into my home. She promised me it was just a phase and that she would go back to Preston soon. She begged me not to say anything. I was so exhausted and overwhelmed that I just gave up and went to bed. I figured Preston would pick her up in a day or two, and being back in her own house would break the spell. I have never regretted a decision more in my entire life. If I had just forced her to leave, that night maybe, I would not have permanent mental scars. Night 3 was the tipping point where the absolute primal horror took over. I woke up in the dead of night because little Toby was fussing and whining in his sleep. I laid there for a few minutes waiting for Daisy to wake up and soothe him, but she was completely unresponsive. I dragged myself out of bed feeling super annoyed because I had no idea how to change a diaper, but the poor kid was clearly uncomfortable. The room was pitch black, except for the faint orange glow of the street lamp outside, bleeding through the window blinds. I knelt down next to Toby and managed to get his diaper changed. The room was absolutely suffocatingly silent until I heard this slow, deliberate, wet smacking sound coming from the other side of the mattress, right behind me. It sounded like raw meat being rhythmically slapped against a wet tile floor, and it made the hairs on my arms stand straight up. I slowly turned my head and looked at Daisy. The blanket was kicked all the way down to her ankles. She was completely naked. But it was not just the nudity that broke my brain. It was her posture. Her legs were bent and spread unnaturally wide open into a rigid M shape. Her back was arched off the mattress. Her lips were completely puckered outward, and her tongue was sticking out, rolling around and licking the empty air, like a disgusting bottom-feeder fish sucking algae off a glass tank. She was actively writhing and letting out these deep guttural moans of pure pleasure. I was paralyzed. My brain simply could not process the sickening reality of what I was looking at. I grabbed the heavy winter blanket and aggressively threw it over her entire body. I started slapping her arms and yelling her name to wake her up. She opened her eyes and looked at me with this completely annoyed expression. She asked me why I was interrupting her. I was shaking so violently I could barely speak. I asked her what the actual hell she was doing naked and contorted like a freak while her baby was crying right next to her. I asked her if the spirit was forcing itself on her. Her answer still haunts me to this day. She smiled and casually told me that it was completely consensual. She said Derek missed her, and since he was just a ghost now, it did not really count as cheating on Preston, because there was no physical body, and she could not get pregnant. She told me to just keep it a secret. I sat there on the floor, feeling like I was losing my goddamn mind. You guys have to understand how terrifying it is to look at someone you have known for years and realize there is absolutely nothing human left behind their eyes. The Doyenam had completely rewired her brain to prioritize sexual spiritual gratification over her own child and her reality. For those who do not know, Doyenam is a Vietnamese term for a twisted, karmic bond with the dead. It is not just a regular haunting. It is a parasitic spiritual marriage where a ghost manipulates your dreams and physical desires until you willingly surrender your own life force to be with them. I wanted to call a monk right then and there, but it was the middle of the night. I stayed awake until the sun came up, holding Toby tightly against my chest. I decided I would call Preston first thing the next morning, but Derek beat me to it. Night 4 was when the safety boundary was completely shattered. I was in a deep, exhausted sleep when Daisy violently shook me awake. She was gripping my arms so tight her nails were digging into my skin. She was crying hysterically. I asked her what was wrong. She choked on her tears and told me Derek had changed his mind in the dream. He did not want just her anymore. She looked at me with sheer panic and repeated what he told her. "I am taking my son now." He told her the paper house was fully furnished, and he was taking Toby down first to get him settled, and then he would come back for her later. I instantly whipped my head around to look at the baby. Toby was laying flat on his back, doing that horrifying silent cry where a baby is screaming so hard no sound comes out, and they stop breathing. His tiny fists were clenched by his sides. But the worst part was his eyes. They were completely rolled back into his skull, showing nothing but pure white sclera as he stared fixedly at the dark ceiling above him. I absolutely lost my fucking mind. The primal survival instinct just completely took over my body. I threw myself across the room and started wildly lighting a handful of incense sticks at my small earth god shrine. I did not care about being quiet anymore. I ripped open the kitchen cabinet and grabbed a giant plastic jar of raw rice and coarse sea salt. In our culture, throwing rice and salt acts like spiritual tear gas against dark entities. I started violently hurling handfuls of the salt and rice mixture all over the room, bouncing it off the walls and raining it down on the mattress. I was screaming at the top of my lungs, cursing the entity with every vile word I knew. I grabbed a sharp Thai fruit knife from the counter and a pair of dirty, unwashed underwear from my laundry basket. Using dirty clothes is supposed to be an extreme insult that breaks a spirit's focus through raw human impurity. I was standing in the middle of my tiny apartment, waving a knife and dirty underwear in the air, screaming at a dead guy to get the fuck out of my house and stay away from the kid. It was a complete clusterfuck. After about 2 minutes of me acting like an absolute lunatic, Toby suddenly gasped for air. The terrifying silence broke as he let out a piercing wail. His eyes snapped back to normal. He started crying hysterically and pointed his chubby little finger straight at my locked front door. He kept sobbing and repeating the word "Dada" over and over again, pointing at the empty space. I immediately grabbed my phone and called Preston. I did not sugarcoat anything. I told him his wife was being spiritually assaulted by her dead ex-boyfriend, and the ghost just tried to take his son. I told him to get his ass over here and pick up his family before someone actually died. Preston showed up 30 minutes later looking completely bewildered, but he took them home. Preston has a very strong dominant energy, and his house is heavily protected with ancestral altars, so the spirit could not easily cross that threshold. But I knew the entity was still lingering, waiting for Daisy to step outside. The next morning, I told Daisy we were going to the only person who could actually stop this. We drove straight to Derek's mother's house. We sat down in her living room, and I told her every single graphic detail. I told her how her dead son was trying to ruin a married woman's life and steal a baby. The poor woman broke down in tears. She genuinely loved Daisy and hated what her son had become. She did not call a monk. She did not burn incense. She simply stood up, walked into her kitchen, and grabbed a heavy meat cleaver. She marched over to Derek's memorial altar in the corner of the room. She looked at his smiling funeral portrait with pure maternal rage. She pressed the sharp edge of the cleaver directly against her own throat. I could actually see a thin line of real blood bead up against the steel. She did not yell. She spoke in this low vibrating tone of absolute authority. She told the empty room that she had suffered her entire life because of him. She told his spirit that if he ever went near Daisy, or that baby again, she would slice her own throat, right there, on his altar. She swore that she would follow him down into the deepest pit of hell, and spend eternity torturing him herself. The air in the room instantly felt lighter. It was like a massive pressure valve had been released. A mother's blood oath is the most powerful magic in the world, and Derek was always terrified of his mom, even when he was alive. We left the house shortly after, and the haunting completely stopped. Daisy went crawling back to Preston to apologize, and of course, he took her back. It was actually kind of hilarious because a few weeks later, she was texting me asking to help her look up 18+ bedroom tips online so she could make it up to her husband. I guess that was her weird way of scrubbing the ghost out of her system. Eventually, everything settled down. The dead guy crawled back to hell, and my friend went back to her husband. Everyone went back to their own lives. You know how it is. First loves are always persistent, but sometimes you just have to know how to bury them properly. So the story is over now. But hey, are you lying in bed listening to this alone right now, or are you next to your partner? Just take a quick look at the person next to you. If you see that their eyes are squeezed shut, but their lips are curled up into this wide, sickening smile, do not wake them up. Their first love might just be taking a stroll through their dreams right now. And trust me, you do not want to interrupt the fun of a dead man. Sleep well. I still remember the exact policy they drilled into my head on my very first night working at that sketchy restaurant. They told me that once you're assigned to a private karaoke room, you are completely bound to it until the guests decide to leave. You couldn't take other tables or wander off. You were essentially held hostage by whatever mob bosses or shady businessmen rented the space, forced to smile and turn a blind eye while they did whatever twisted crap they wanted. The pay was garbage, but the tips were crazy. So you just learned to swallow your pride, stare at the wall, and act like a piece of furniture. I'm in my early 40s now, but back in 2007, I was just a broke 20-something college kid who just moved to Saigon from the provinces. Life was incredibly tough back then. Finding a decent part-time job was a nightmare, because most employers hated hiring students. They thought we were lazy and would just quit whenever exams rolled around. I actually bounced around a few dead-end gigs for months, before a buddy of mine finally hooked me up with this place, so I actually had to lie during my interview. I hid my student ID, put on this whole act, complaining about how poor my family was back home, and how I desperately needed the money to survive. That was the only reason the manager let me in. The place was this massive, multi-level Chinese restaurant right near the Fudong intersection. It had been around since before the year 2000, famous for serving a really wild mix of customers. We're talking high-end executives, sketchy underground mob guys, and even off-duty cops. These were the kind of heavy hitters who rolled up in expensive cars, the kind of faces you'd usually only see in newspaper headlines. The restaurant management knew perfectly well that these guys threw cash around just to show off, so they used that as a filthy excuse to pay us a practically non-existent base salary. It was purely exploitative, but the older waiters told me to shut up and stop worrying about the paycheck. They said the real money was in the tips. The culture inside those VIP rooms was something else. You'd stand in the corner like a statue, and whenever a guest needed ice, you'd rush over with the tongs. Or they'd ask for a cold towel, and back in those days, we didn't have those cheap, pre-packaged wet wipes. We had these thick frozen towels wrapped in clear plastic. You had to take the towel, give it a really hard snap with your hands to pop the plastic bag with a loud smack, and then unroll it for the guest. If you did that smoothly and smiled, they'd casually toss you a 50,000 dong bill. That was roughly a couple of bucks back then, all in paper money since polymer notes weren't fully everywhere yet. On my very first night, I remember getting tipped in these crumpled up 5,000 and 10,000 dong bills, scraping together maybe 30 or 40 grand, and I was thrilled. If you got tipped just a few times a night, you could make around 15 million dong a month. That was an absolute fortune back then, enough to buy an entire tail of solid gold. Everyone fought tooth and nail for the VIP room shifts. Originally, the restaurant just had an open dining floor on the bottom level, and the second and third floors were just empty spaces where the staff used to sleep. But the owner, who was heavily connected with the local underworld, realized that his wealthy clients wanted privacy. They wanted closed doors, air conditioning, karaoke machines, and young VIP bottle girls to sit with them. So he completely gutted the upper floors and built these massive VIP rooms, each featuring a massive table built to sit 10 to 12 people. When I started working there, the rooms were so new that the smell of fresh industrial paint was still burning my nostrils. On my 5th or 6th day, my manager assigned me to a newly finished room on the 2nd floor. The rule was strict. When they said you belonged to that room, you didn't leave until the bill was paid. But here's the catch. When the guests started getting drunk and too hands-on with the working girls, they obviously didn't want the waitstaff standing there staring at them. So, whenever things got wild and inappropriate inside, I was expected to step out and give them privacy. I'd pull up a tiny plastic stool right outside the heavy glass door in the hallway. I was still locked to serving only that room, just sitting there in the cold AC, peeking through the glass, waiting for someone inside to point at an empty ice bucket so I could rush back in. A group of 4 men walked in around 7 p.m. Actually, wait, I think it might have been 5 guys initially, but one left early. Yeah, whatever, it doesn't matter. There were 4 left in the room. They looked like serious trouble, the kind of guys you read about in the crime section of the newspaper. I spent the first 2 hours just running back and forth, opening green glass bottles of Heineken, filling ice buckets, and staying out of their way. But these guys were incredibly cheap. They were buying drinks for the bottle girls, who were all wearing these tight silk chong sams with dangerously deep thigh slits, but they completely ignored me. I even had to mop up a puddle of vomit from one of the guys right there on the floor, and they still didn't toss me a single coin. Not a single tip came my way, and I was getting pretty annoyed, just standing in the cold air conditioning feeling sorry for myself. I noticed one of the guests was acting really hostile. He was a short, heavy guy with a bald spot, a massive beer belly, and this weird mole right on his upper lip, with one long, gross hair hanging off it like a dog leash. The other guys called him Sonny. He kept aggressively complaining to the bottle girls, telling them they were nowhere near as pretty as a girl named Cassie. He kept comparing their figures, loudly criticizing them, praising Cassie's big boobs, tiny waist, and fat ass, saying her skin was cool to the touch, and drunkenly rambling about how he should have dragged her to a hotel when he had the chance. I watched as Haley, one of the VIP bottle girls sitting next to him, went completely pale. She nervously stuttered and tried to calm him down, whispering that Cassie had refused to take any more clients and was eventually fired and sent back to her hometown. She begged him to just let it go, but the guy wouldn't drop it. He kept ranting about how they should have trapped her in debt and beaten the stubbornness out of her until she served them, saying it was a total waste to send a body like that back to the countryside to farm. By the time the clock hit maybe 9:15 p.m., the room was a total mess. They'd emptied 3 or 4 entire crates of glass beer bottles. The music was deafening, the bass was vibrating through my chest, and the guys were completely wasted. 2 of them were passed out on the leather sofa, and another guy was slouched over the table holding a microphone, dragging out this cheesy, out-of-tune love song like, "I miss you." I was sitting on my small stool right outside the heavy glass door, just waiting for someone to yell for more ice. Suddenly, the door violently burst open. Haley and 2 other bottle girls came sprinting out into the hallway. Their faces were chalk white, and they were hyperventilating. They grabbed my shirt and frantically whispered that the bald guy, Sonny, had been possessed by Cassie. I honestly thought they were joking. I was young, totally fearless, and I didn't believe in the supernatural at all. I figured the drunk old guy probably just got a little too handsy, and scared the working girls. I rolled my eyes and pushed past them into the room to see what the big deal was. The air inside the room felt incredibly heavy and freezing cold. The music had stopped playing, leaving this dead, suffocating silence. The guy who had just been singing was so wasted he didn't even realize the track had ended. He was just sitting there in the dead quiet, blindly punching numbers into one of those old-school Ari-Rang karaoke remotes to pick the next song, completely oblivious to what was happening. I looked around the large table and realized the bald guy was missing from his seat. Then I heard a sickening crunching sound coming from the floor. I leaned over and looked under the massive dining table. It was a large four-legged table, so it was pretty spacious underneath. The floor was covered in broken green glass from smashed beer bottles. And right in the middle of that mess, Sonny, the overweight mob boss, was crawling on his hands and knees. I couldn't process what I was looking at. He was maneuvering through the sharp glass, his stomach dragging on the floor, and he was making these slow, exaggerated feminine movements. I'm not going to spell it out, but you know exactly what kind of motion a cheap hooker makes under a table, right? It was being performed by a 50-year-old mafia guy. It was the most deeply unsettling, depraved thing I had ever witnessed. He slowly reached down and unbuckled his leather belt, pulling his shirt out of his trousers. My brain immediately tried to rationalize it. Back in 2007, seeing something like that was a huge shock, so I genuinely thought maybe these tough guys were secretly playing some weird, submissive gay roleplay behind closed doors. But then I heard his voice. It wasn't his deep, raspy grunt anymore. It was pitched up, breathy, and dripping with this unnatural sweetness that made my stomach tie into knots. "It's Cassie, boys. Let me relax you. Don't you remember me?" He crawled out from under the table and practically lunged at his passed-out friends. The guy on the sofa woke up, his eyes widening in absolute horror as his buddy started caressing his chest and trying to kiss his neck. The possessed man kept whispering Cassie's name over and over, wrapping his arms around his friends, acting completely unhinged and deeply inappropriate. The other guests were completely paralyzed with shock. One of them scrambled away, yelling at Sonny, asking what the hell he was doing, screaming that they had been drinking buddies for years and he never knew Sonny was into men. But the entity inside Sonny just giggled. She stared right at the terrified friend and spoke through the mobster's mouth. "It is Cassie. Weren't you fighting over me the other day? Didn't you tell my boss to beat me until I served you? Well, I am here to serve you now." Sonny just kept rubbing his own chest, making these disgusting squelching sounds, literally pinching his own nipples before trying to force his fingers into his friend's mouth. What the absolute fuck, right? The whole ordeal lasted for maybe 3 endless minutes before he suddenly gasped. His body went entirely rigid, and he collapsed backward into a chair. He ripped his own shirt open in a daze, stared at the ceiling for a second, and then passed out cold. When he finally came to a few minutes later, he had absolutely no memory of what just happened. He looked down at his unbuckled pants and his torn shirt in total confusion, angrily slurring at his friends, demanding to know why the hell they had stripped him while he was passed out. The panic in the room was contagious. His friends instantly sobered up, grabbed him by the arms, and dragged him out of the room. They ordered me to call a 7-seater Milan taxi right away. Before they sped off into the night, one of the guys grabbed me by the collar and aggressively warned me to keep my mouth shut about everything I saw. After they left, we all gathered at a street noodle cart in a dark alley behind the restaurant. We were just squatting on these tiny plastic stools past midnight, and the clinking of the wooden spoons against the porcelain bowls was the only normal sound keeping me grounded. I begged the bottle girls to explain what the hell I had just witnessed. They were terrified of the owner finding out, but they eventually cracked. If any of you listening have ever worked in a place that has a deeply buried, violent history, you know that the building itself almost feels like it's trying to tell you the truth. If you've ever felt that heavy, oppressive energy in a room where something terrible happened, please tell me I'm not crazy in the comments. Because for the longest time, I thought my mind was just playing tricks on me. They told me that Cassie was the most gorgeous high-end escort the restaurant ever had. The unspoken rule in that joint, was that bottle girls were strictly 17 to 20 years old. Once you hit 21, you were considered washed up, pushed aside to just play scratch cards in the corner instead of serving the high rollers. But Cassie was the exception. She was a total diva. She knew she was the main attraction, and she refused to entertain any guest who tipped less than $100. Her motto was literally, "I choose the clients, they don't choose me." She even rejected clients based on their looks. She would literally just claim it was her time of the month to avoid them and go shopping for designer clothes down on Wintray Street instead. And that creepy crawling routine under the table? The working girls told me that was actually Cassie's signature move when she was alive. A twisted little game she played to get the rich clients completely hooked on her. But it got worse. Since her death, guests would frequently complain about terrifying hallucinations. A group of 3 guys would hire 3 working girls, but after getting totally wasted, they'd suddenly realize there were 4 girls sitting on the sofa with them. Then, that extra girl would slowly slide off the couch and crawl under the table to unbuckle their belts. They'd think it was a fun new trick, right up until they looked under the table and saw a rotting ghost face staring back at them. The bald mob boss who got possessed was actually the main protection guy for our restaurant. He was powerful, dangerous, and incredibly ugly. He had requested Cassie 3 separate times, and she rejected him every single time. On that 4th night, when she gave him the same excuse, he completely lost his mind. He started screaming that it was impossible for a woman to have her period every single day of the month. He stormed out of the VIP room, marched straight up the stairs to the staff sleeping quarters, and dragged her out of bed. He beat her mercilessly. The working girls said he took something sharp and destroyed her beautiful face so she could never look down on anyone again. The owner of the restaurant ran upstairs to intervene, but the mobster threatened to cut his head off and burn the business to the ground if Cassie wasn't permanently dealt with by morning. The owner forced all the other bottle girls to grab their blankets and sleep downstairs in the empty lobby. Throughout the entire night, they laid there in the dark, listening to Cassie screaming and crying, begging the men to stop. She promised she'd do whatever they wanted, sobbing that she would happily perform all 69 positions if they just let her live. But the wet, heavy thwacks of flesh being whipped and slapped just continued until the building went dead silent. The next morning, the owner casually announced that Cassie had been put on a bus at the Yanante station back to her village, but one of the working girls had gotten up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night. Since the restaurant didn't have an elevator, she had to take the stairs. From the landing, she peeked out the window and saw the owner's bodyguards carrying a long, heavy, human-sized bag completely wrapped in silver duct tape. They shoved it into the trunk of a car and drove off. A few weeks after that night, the owner ordered massive renovations. He converted the staff bedrooms on the 2nd and 3rd floors into the brand new VIP rooms. He built the exact room I was standing in right over the spot where her blood had soaked into the floorboards. He tried to bury the crime scene under thick layers of concrete and fresh paint. He even brought in underground shamans to exorcise the place, but her spirit was too furious to be banished. But you can't just paint over a murdered girl's rage. Cassie never left. I was absolutely sick to my stomach hearing this, but I convinced myself that the ghost only targeted the men who hurt her. I was just a broke college kid serving drinks. I told myself I was safe. I was so incredibly stupid. A couple of weeks later, it was a packed Friday night. The restaurant was completely chaotic. A table of businessmen took a liking to me and aggressively forced me to drink 4 or 5 green bottles of Tiger and Heineken with them. I had 0 tolerance back then. By 10 p.m., the room was spinning, my vision was blurring, and I felt the bile rising in my throat. I stumbled out of the room to find a bathroom so I could force myself to throw up and sober up. The layout of the building was a total nightmare. On the 2nd floor, the men's room was on the right, but I was working on the 3rd floor that night, and for some ridiculous reason, they flipped the plumbing, so the men's room was on the left. I was so dizzy and disoriented that I wandered up the hallway and kicked open the door on the right, completely unaware I was walking into the women's restroom. I collapsed over the toilet bowl and just started violently dry heaving. The cold porcelain felt good against my sweating forehead, I was coughing and spitting when I heard the heavy wooden door creak open behind me. I heard wet footsteps slowly padding across the tile floor, and then the squeak of the sink faucet turning on. I didn't care. I assumed it was one of the bottle girls taking a break. I was still retching into the bowl when I suddenly felt a hand gently land on the back of my neck. It was a deeply professional touch, the kind of soft, practiced caress the high-end escorts used on clients. I could feel the cold tips of long acrylic nails lightly scraping down my spine. I groaned, thinking Haley had taken pity on me and followed me in to help me sober up. I finally emptied my stomach. If you've ever thrown up from drinking too much, you know that horrible feeling when you stand back up. You see stars, and the whole room spins like crazy. I wiped my mouth, grabbed the edges of the stall, and slowly pushed myself up on shaky legs. I turned around, squinting through the harsh fluorescent light, and saw a girl standing right by the sink. Her head was tilted down, and her long black hair was falling over her face as she quietly sobbed into her hands. I stumbled out of the stall, genuinely concerned. I slurred my words, asking if she was okay, asking if she was Haley or Maya, and if some aggressive client had hurt her or refused to tip. She stopped crying. The bathroom fell into a suffocating silence. The water was still running from the faucet. She kept her face pointed at the floor, but her voice echoed perfectly clear off the bathroom tiles. "It's me, Cassie. You were looking for me yesterday and now you don't even know who I am?" My drunk brain couldn't process the name. I took another step forward, waving my hand dismissively, telling her to stop messing around and just look up so I could recognize her. She slowly raised her head, sweeping her hair back with her pale hands. "It's Cassie. I am Cassie." She suddenly lunged at me, closing the distance in a split second. She threw her freezing arms around my neck, pressing her body completely against mine. She leaned in, sucking on my earlobe like some depraved, sex-crazed maniac, making this awful, wet slurping sound. The smell hit me instantly. It was the overwhelming stench of cheap floral perfume completely masking the heavy metallic smell of rotting meat. I panicked. I grabbed her by the shoulders and shoved her away from me as hard as I could. She stumbled back into the harsh light, and for the first time, I clearly saw her face. She had this perfectly straight nose and peach-shaped lips, but her skin was a sickening, bloated shade of purple. Her lips were a dark, unnatural blue, like someone who had suffocated to death, and carved across her cheeks and forehead were deep, jagged lacerations, thick with dried, black blood that looked like someone had repeatedly dragged a broken bottle across her flesh. She just stood there, her eyes bulging out of her skull, her jaw hanging open as she kept whispering my name. I completely lost my grip on reality. The sheer terror paralyzed my lungs. I literally screamed, "Holy fucking shit," as I took one step back. My knees buckled, and I hit the wet tile floor, passing out instantly. I woke up a while later to the sounds of the bottle girls slapping my face and splashing cold water on me. I was completely hysterical, screaming that I had just seen Cassie. The working girls immediately shushed me, looking around in absolute terror. They called me a crazy outsider running my mouth about things I didn't understand, begging me not to say her name out loud in the building. I stuck around for maybe another month. Back in those days, gold was incredibly cheap, and hoarding physical gold was exactly how working-class people invested their savings. Honestly, it was kind of like how people treat crypto today. I just wanted to survive long enough to save up my tip money, buy a solid tail of gold, and get the hell out. The toxic, backstabbing drama among the staff finally pushed me over the edge, and I completely cut ties with that District 1 joint. But the exhaustion from those graveyard shifts still haunts me. I'll be in my room, half asleep, listening to the hum of the AC, just trying to find some peace. Then the white noise sort of warps, pulling me back into that cramped, freezing bathroom. And just before I lose consciousness, I can almost feel cold, dead lips against my earlobe, whispering, "Cassie is right here." So, This isn't your typical ghost story about a creepy hotel or a haunted lake in Dalat. This actually happened at one of those old-school acoustic music lounges. Just to give you some context, back in the day, before 1975, Dalat was like the ultimate playground for the rich and the military elites, so these lounges were built exclusively for them. I'm keeping the name anonymous, but this place was ancient. Anyway, back in 2017, when I was 17, I got dragged there by my parents. They aren't celebrities or anything, but my mom has this massive diva energy and loves singing, to the point where we have an actual stage with like 3 guitars in our house in Saigon. She knows all these old lounge singers across the country, so my job on every family trip was basically to be her personal cameraman. And that night in Dalat was supposed to be just another gig for me. I remember it was a really cold night. We were driving around the winding roads of the city at maybe 6:45 p.m. The fog was incredibly thick, the kind that sticks to your clothes and makes you shiver down to your bones. I was sitting in the back seat just staring at my phone, complaining about how bored I was. I really didn't want to go listen to music that was popular 50 years ago, but my parents were super hyped. My mom had been chatting with this local singer online for weeks, and they had planned this whole duet thing. When we finally arrived at the address, it didn't even look like a business. We had to walk down this really steep, slippery slope to get to the entrance. The moment I stepped inside that building, my nose was immediately hit with that heavy, undeniable scent of time. You know what I mean. It smelled like damp wood, old dust, and closed-off rooms that haven't seen natural sunlight in decades. It was the kind of smell that just settles into the back of your throat. The interior was incredibly dark. They were super stingy with the lighting in there. The only real light came from these tiny candles placed on each of the tables, casting these long, flickering shadows against the walls. The only bright spot in the entire room was a single, harsh spotlight pointed directly at the wooden stage up front. It felt like stepping into a time capsule from the 1960s. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper that was peeling at the edges, and I could even see thick cobwebs in the upper corners when the candlelight caught them. We sat down at a table near the front, snacking on some sunflower seeds they had on the tables, and my dad ordered some drinks. I think a single cup of coffee was roughly $20. That was a complete rip-off, but I guess you are paying for the whole exclusive live music atmosphere. The place was practically empty. There were maybe 8 or 9 people in total, including my family of 3. It was supposed to be peak hours for a music lounge, but it was dead quiet. You could literally hear the wooden floorboards creaking under the waiter's feet when he brought our drinks. A local singer was up on stage doing her thing, singing these old, slow Trin music and vintage bolero tracks. She was the lady who had invited my mom. After a couple of songs, this singer grabbed the microphone and announced to the tiny crowd that she had a special guest from Saigon with a beautiful vintage voice. She then looked right at our table and invited my mom to come up to the stage. Normally, my mom would just confidently strut up there and take the spotlight. She lives for this kind of stuff, but as she stood up and smoothed out her clothes, the singer rushed down from the stage and hurried over to our table. I already had my phone out. I was holding it up, recording the whole thing because that was my job. I figured they were just discussing what song to sing together or what key the band needed to play in. But through my phone screen, I noticed my mom frowning. Her eyebrows furrowed together, and she looked super confused. She just kept shaking her head side to side. The singer kept urging her, looking kind of desperate and pleading with her hands, but my mom flat out refused. After about a minute of this awkward back and forth conversation, the singer let out a heavy sigh, told my mom to wait at the table for a second, and literally jogged to the back of the lounge, disappearing behind these heavy velvet stage curtains. I lowered my phone and asked my mom what the heck was going on. My mom looked really annoyed and sat back down. She told us that the singer had asked her to go backstage and light some incense at a small shrine before stepping onto the stage. Now, my family is Catholic. We don't really have the custom of lighting incense for wandering spirits or local entities. My mom is pretty strict about it. She basically told the singer she wasn't comfortable doing that at all. The singer had insisted it was just a normal routine to make sure the performance went smoothly and to show respect to the venue. But my mom stood her ground. She told the lady that she could go light it herself if she wanted to, but she wasn't going to do it. So the singer had to go back there and do it for her. I remember thinking it was super weird, and honestly, a bit sketchy. We had been to dozens of these acoustic lounges all over the country, and nobody ever made us light incense just to sing one guest song. It felt completely unnecessary, and it kind of ruined the fun mood we had going. About a minute later, the singer came back out from behind the curtain, gave my mom a little nod, and walked back up to the microphone. My mom stood up again, and this is exactly where things started getting really screwed up. My mom was dressed to the nines for this occasion. She had this whole retro 70s vibe going on. She was wearing these tight trousers that flared out wide at the bottom around the ankles, and a pair of thick, chunky heels that my dad actually bought for her like 4 or 5 years ago, so she was completely used to walking in them. She had been wearing outfits like that since she was a teenager, so walking in those massive heels was basically second nature to her. She was a total pro at it. I raised my phone and hit the record button again. The walk from our table to the stage was really short, maybe 20 feet at most. For the first few steps, my mom was smiling. She was doing her little diva strut, swaying her hips because she knew I was filming her every move. But then, she suddenly stumbled. It looked like her legs just cramped up out of nowhere. She kept walking forward, but the way she walked got super stiff. She kept looking down at her feet and glancing around her with this panicked, uncomfortable expression. It looked exactly like someone was physically blocking her path or trying to grab at her ankles to trip her up. She finally made it to the single wooden step leading up to the stage. It was a really low step, covered in this cheap, faded red carpet. As soon as she put her foot on it, she just completely wiped out. She fell forward, catching herself hard with her hands on the wooden floorboards of the stage. My dad and I flinched, but she quickly stood back up. She laughed it off, making a quick joke into the mic about how she hasn't even had a single drop of alcohol yet but is already acting drunk, and the few people in the crowd politely clapped. But I could see her face up close through my camera zoom. She looked deeply unnerved. Her smile was completely forced. When she finally stood up there, and the music started, her performance was an absolute disaster. My mom is a genuinely fantastic singer. She has practiced these specific songs 1,000 times in our living room. But the moment she opened her mouth, she was totally off key. It was hard to listen to. She kept forgetting the lyrics, stumbling over words she knew by heart. She was looking around like crazy, her eyes constantly darting toward the dark area behind the red velvet curtains, like she expected something to jump out at her. And the microphone kept glitching out. The local singer beside her sounded perfectly fine, but every single time my mom tried to hit a note, the mic would let out this piercing, ear-splitting screech that echoed through the whole room. It was that horrible, high-pitched feedback sound that makes your teeth hurt, and everyone in the lounge had to cover their ears. My mom would hit the side of the mic in frustration, try to sing again, and the audio would just cut out completely into dead silence. It wasn't a wireless mic either. It was a heavy, wired microphone plugged directly into the system, so it shouldn't have been losing connection like that. A guy had to run out from the back and hand her a replacement mic, but the exact same thing kept happening. Through all of this, I just kept filming. I didn't know what else to do. I had a nearly 6-minute continuous shot on my phone. I was zooming in on her stressed face, panning across the stage, catching the guitar player, zooming in on the drummer, just doing random camera movements to distract myself from how awkward the whole situation was. By the time the dreadful song finally ended, my mom looked utterly defeated. She looked like she wanted to cry from the embarrassment. She practically stomped off the stage, tripping a second time on the exact same wooden step on her way down. When she got back to our table, she didn't even sit down gracefully. She just dropped into her chair. Her face was completely pale, and her jaw was clenched tight. My dad immediately leaned in and asked if her shoes were broken or if the flared pants were getting in her way. She just violently shook her head and whispered that something felt incredibly wrong up there. She told us she literally felt unseen hands grabbing at her ankles and yanking forcefully on the flared fabric of her pants, the entire time she was trying to sing. She said it felt like someone was crouching on the floor, tugging at her clothes to pull her down. But that wasn't even the worst part. She leaned closer to us and said that while she was struggling to sing, she clearly heard a woman's voice coming from right behind the velvet curtains. The voice was loudly mocking her. My mom said the unseen woman was telling her she was completely out of tune, that her outfit looked ridiculous, and demanding she get off the stage so a real singer could perform. My dad and I just stared at her in absolute shock. We had been sitting right in the front row, maybe 10 feet away, and we didn't hear a single voice. We only heard the acoustic guitar and that awful screeching microphone. My mom was so shaken up and angry that she decided to go to the restroom, to splash some cold water on her face and calm down. She handed my dad her purse and walked away into the dark hallway at the back of the room. She was gone for maybe 3 or 4 minutes. When she came back, she didn't look calm at all. She slammed herself down into her chair, her face red with absolute rage. She snatched her purse from the table and told my dad we were leaving immediately. My dad was startled and asked her what the hell happened in there to make her so mad. She told us that as soon as she went into the toilet stall and closed the door, she heard this loud, deliberate clicking sound of heavy heels walking into the empty bathroom. The footsteps stopped right outside her stall. Then, she heard someone violently pounding on her stall door. It wasn't a polite knock. They were slamming their fists against the wood over and over again, like they were trying to break the door off its hinges. My mom was startled, but tried to be polite, calling out that someone was currently using the stall, thinking it was just a drunk or rude customer. But then, the exact same voice she had heard whispering behind the stage curtains started screaming through the bathroom door. "You need to stop singing. You think you can just come up here and ruin my song? You aren't a real singer. You look pathetic in those clothes. You are too old for this. Just go home." My mom is usually a very calm and collected person, but her pride was heavily wounded. Nobody talks to her like that. She threw open the stall door, fully ready to confront whoever was harassing her. She said she stepped out and looked toward the sinks. Standing by the very last sink, about 10 feet away from her, was a woman. The lighting in the bathroom was terrible, just a dim yellow bulb, but my mom could clearly see the woman was wearing a deep dark blue vintage dress. It was the kind of thick, heavy fabric people wore decades ago. Her hair was styled in that massive curly 1970s look that poofs out and covers half the face. She had these sharp, piercing eyes, heavily coated in thick black mascara, and she was just glaring at my mom through the mirror. She didn't blink. She just stared, with this look of pure disgust. My mom didn't even yell at her. She was just so taken aback by how outdated and bizarre the woman looked. She grabbed her things, washed her hands in silence while the woman kept staring, and walked straight out of the bathroom. When my dad heard this, he was absolutely furious. He is a very protective guy, and the idea of some arrogant local singer bullying his wife in a bathroom was complete bullshit and not gonna fly. He stood up, pushed his chair back, and immediately stormed toward the backstage area to find this woman in the blue dress. My mom and I panicked and ran after him, trying to calm him down. We found the local singer who had invited us standing near the audio equipment. My dad angrily approached her and demanded to know who the other woman in the blue dress was and why she was harassing his wife. The singer looked at us with wide, confused eyes. She swore up and down that she was the only performer hired for the entire night. She said the lounge hasn't been able to afford multiple singers in years. There were absolutely no other women working there. My dad was about to yell at her for lying, but the singer's face suddenly dropped. All the color drained from her cheeks. She swallowed hard and quietly asked my mom if she had seen a woman in a dark blue dress with big curly hair. My mom nodded, still looking angry. The singer closed her eyes, took a deep, shaky breath, grabbed a small flashlight from a shelf, and told us to follow her. She led us into the tight, confusing maze of thick curtains behind the stage. It was incredibly dark back there, and it smelled strongly of dust, old wood, and heavy incense. We walked past old microphone stands and broken chairs until we reached a tiny, cramped corner at the very back wall of the building. Sitting right on the floorboards, hidden away from the public eye, was a tiny beat-up, rotten little wooden shrine. There was a rusted incense burner sitting in front of it, filled to the brim with gray ash and the stubs of burnt incense sticks. The singer knelt down on the floor, gently pushed the incense burner to the side with her hand, and revealed a small black and white photograph leaning against the back of the shrine. It was no bigger than the palm of my hand. My mom looked down at the photo, and she let out this choked, terrified gasp. She grabbed my dad's arm so hard I could see her knuckles turning white. I felt the blood completely drain from my face, leaving me freezing cold. I leaned in and looked down at the picture. Holy fucking shit. It was the exact same woman from the bathroom. The exact same massive curly hair. The exact same sharp, piercing eyes staring back at us through the faded black and white paper. The singer stayed on her knees and quietly explained the history to us. She said the woman in the photo used to be the absolute biggest star in Dalat back in the 1960s. She was incredibly beautiful and famous, but she was also deeply jealous and possessive of her stage. She hated whenever new talent came to town. She used to stand hidden behind the velvet curtains and whisper awful, nasty, messed up shit to the younger singers to make them panic and mess up their performances. She ruined a lot of careers that way, but her attitude made her a lot of dangerous enemies. The singer told us that one night, a rival performer hired some local gangsters. They stormed right into the lounge while the woman in the blue dress was performing in front of a packed crowd. They dragged her down and stabbed her repeatedly, right on that stage. The singer said the woman bled to death on the wooden floorboards before anyone could even get her to a hospital. She was only in her 20s. The singer looked up at my mom with this sad, tired expression and explained that ever since that night, 50 years ago, the woman still fiercely haunts the stage. She believes she still owns it. Anyone who wants to perform on that stage, whether they are a professional or a guest, has to light incense at her shrine to ask for her permission. If you don't show her that respect, she will step out from the shadows and ruin you. Because my mom had stubbornly refused to light the incense earlier, the ghost saw it as an insult and targeted her directly. The singer quietly told us that lighting a stick of incense doesn't belong to any specific religion. It's just a basic sign of respect for the dead. Hearing that, we didn't argue. My parents and I took the lighter, lit 3 sticks of incense, and placed them carefully in the burner. We actually didn't run out right away. To be polite to the singer, my mom forced us to go back to our table, sit there completely terrified, and wait through 3 whole agonizing songs before we finally packed up and left. Later on, when we were safely away from that place and finally back at our hotel room, my mom asked me for the video. She wanted to see exactly what we had caught on camera during that cursed performance. I tried to send the 6-minute clip to her on Zalo, but the app just wouldn't work. I turned off the Wi-Fi, switched to 3G, put my phone on airplane mode, and took it off, but it just kept giving me connection errors. Before we gave up on sending it, we actually sat there and watched the clip on my screen. The audio in the video was totally screwed up. You couldn't hear my mom singing at all. It was just the instruments and this horrible, static, hissing sound. But then, I got to the part where I was panning the camera around. At one point, I had zoomed into this dark corner of the stage where they kept all the heavy amps and audio receivers. I held the camera there for about 3 seconds. For the first second, there was nothing. But then, right there on the screen, a figure literally faded into the frame. It was her. The opacity was maybe at 30 or 40%, like a hazy, semi-transparent ghost, but you could distinctly see her deep blue dress, aggressively contrasting against the bright red velvet curtains behind her. She was just standing there, glaring daggers directly at my mom. We were so freaked out that we just locked the phone and decided to deal with it later. Fast forward a couple of days, our trip ended, and we got back home to Saigon. My mom wanted to show the video to her friends to prove she wasn't crazy. I unlocked my phone and went straight to my albums, but the 6-minute video was completely missing. The weird part is, the tiny 10-second clip of her just standing up from her chair was still there, sitting right where the long video should have been. The rest of it had just vanished into thin air. My mom got really mad, accusing me of accidentally deleting it, but I swear on my life I didn't touch it. It hit me right then and there that the woman in the blue dress didn't just mess with the stage, she wiped the proof of her existence from my device. I literally felt my knees give out. If I remember correctly, it's right after the holidays in 2018, back when I was just finishing up my senior year of high school. My aunt, my mom's younger sister, got into a scooter accident and shattered her leg, ending up in a Saitsan hospital to get a bunch of metal hardware installed. She was constantly talking about how incredibly kind her doctor was during her stay, though I just kinda tuned it out. Then summer rolled around, and she had to go back in for a few days to get the metal taken out, which is when my mom made me go stay the night with her, since my aunt didn't have a husband or kids to help out. I was 18 years old at the time. The absolute last thing any 18-year-old wants to do during their summer vacation is sleep on a rock-hard canvas cot in a depressing hospital room. But my mom isn't the kind of person you can argue with, so I packed a small bag, grabbed my phone charger, and dragged myself down to the hospital around 7 p.m. that first evening. Saigon in July is just brutally hot. It's that thick, sticky kind of heat where you step outside and immediately feel like you need another shower. But the second you walk through those sliding glass doors into the hospital lobby, you get hit with this blast of overworked air conditioning mixed with the harsh chemical smell of industrial bleach and old rubbing alcohol. It's a very specific smell that just instantly puts a knot in your stomach. I made my way up to my aunt's room on the 3rd floor. It was a standard shared room, but thankfully it wasn't too crowded that night. I brought her some dinner that my mom had packed, and when I sat down next to her bed, I noticed that her eyes were completely red and glassy. She looked like she had just been crying her eyes out right before I walked in. I asked her if the new pain meds were making her nauseous or if her leg was hurting her too much. She just shook her head, wiped her eyes quickly, and mumbled that she was just feeling a little down and that it was nothing to worry about. My aunt has always been a very introverted person. She keeps everything bottled up inside, even from our own family, so I knew pushing her to talk about her feelings was going to be a total waste of time. I just nodded and told her to eat her food while it was still warm. By the time 10 p.m. rolled around, or maybe it was closer to 11 p.m. since the nurses had already done their final rounds and turned off the main overhead lights, my aunt was fast asleep. Her breathing was heavy and rhythmic. I was sitting on my little folding cot right next to her bed, staring at my phone. Like any normal high school kid, I was completely addicted to mobile games. At the time, I was heavily into this multiplayer battle arena game, basically like League of Legends for your phone. I reached into my pocket to grab my Bluetooth earbuds so I could hop on a voice call with my friends and start grinding some ranked matches, but my pocket was empty. I had left them sitting on my desk at home. I cursed under my breath. Playing a competitive team game completely muted is incredibly frustrating because you can't hear the audio cues when an enemy is sneaking up on you. But I also knew I couldn't play with the volume on inside the room. My aunt needed her rest, and I didn't want to be that annoying relative who wakes up the whole ward. So I grabbed my phone, quietly stepped out of the room, and gently pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind me. The hallway was almost completely deserted. They dimmed the lights in the corridors at night, leaving only these sparse fluorescent tubes humming every 20 feet or so. Half of them were flickering, casting these long, stretched-out shadows across the shiny linoleum floor. It was quiet. Too quiet, honestly. Just the low, mechanical drone of the central air vents and the occasional distant beep of a heart monitor from somewhere down the hall. I found a spot on the floor right next to my aunt's door. I sat down, pressed my back against the cool plaster wall, stretched my legs out, and booted up the game. I turned my phone volume up to exactly 50%. That felt like a safe compromise. It was loud enough for me to hear the game, but I figured the thick hospital walls would block the noise from reaching my aunt. If you have ever played those types of games, You know exactly how loud and chaotic the sound design is. It's just a constant barrage of clashing swords, magical explosions, gold coins clinking, and this loud announcer voice booming every time someone gets taken down. On top of that, I was highly invested in the match. I was whispering aggressively at my screen, basically talking to my teammates even though they couldn't hear me. I was saying stuff like, "Hey, push the top lane. Watch out, they're coming down mid. Let's go take the boss monster now." I was completely dialed in. The real world around me just entirely faded away into the background. I had been sitting there for maybe 5 or 7 minutes when the sound started. I heard this very distinct, hurried clicking sound echoing down the hallway like the hard plastic heels of dress shoes, striking the floor tiles with this sharp click, 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 getting louder and closer by the absolute second. Now, I was sitting in the middle of a major city hospital. Doctors and nurses walking fast down a hallway at midnight is the most normal thing in the world. I didn't even look up from my screen. I just kept mashing the buttons on my phone, totally absorbed in trying to defend my virtual base. I really couldn't have cared less about whoever was walking by. That was until the footsteps stopped right next to me. I'm not exaggerating. They stopped completely dead, right beside my legs. Out of the very bottom corner of my peripheral vision, just past the edge of my glowing phone screen, I could see a pair of stark white slacks, the exact kind of professional white trousers that doctors wear under their lab coats. I stayed looking down at my phone. I figured a nurse was just pausing to check a chart on the door or something. I even kept playing, trying to be a bit more polite by lowering my voice and leaning into the phone mic, whispering stuff like, "I'm down mid right now, I'm down mid," while a few seconds passed in total silence. Then, a voice spoke right above my head. "Kid, it's late. You are being too loud. How is your aunt supposed to rest?" The voice was stern but very calm. It sounded exactly like a disappointed teacher. I immediately felt a flush of embarrassment. I paused my game and looked up to apologize. Standing over me was a female doctor. I got a very clear, detailed look at her face under the dim hallway lights. She was an older woman, probably in her mid to late 50s. She had a somewhat wide, gentle face with a very distinct haircut. It was a short bob, cut perfectly straight right at jaw level. She was wearing a pair of round, rimless glasses that caught the reflection of my phone screen. I scrambled to turn my volume completely down to 0. I nodded my head politely and mumbled that I was so sorry and that I would keep it completely quiet. She didn't say another word. She just stared at me for a split second longer, then turned and kept walking down the hall past me. As she stepped past my legs, I felt it. It was a wall of cold air. Not just a slight chill from the air conditioning. It was a deep, biting, unnatural freezing temperature that instantly made all the tiny hairs on my arms stand straight up. It felt exactly like when you open the heavy metal door of a walk-in meat freezer and that thick cloud of sub-zero vapor hits your face. It literally made me shiver, involuntarily, honestly feeling like a literal walking ice cube had just casually strolled right past me in the middle of a sweltering July night. I sat there for a second, rubbing my arms, trying to rationalize it. I told myself that hospitals just keep the AC blasting at night to kill bacteria, and maybe she had just walked out of a particularly cold supply closet. You know how it is when you are alone in the dark. Your brain will jump through endless logical hoops to protect your sanity and keep you from panicking over something weird. I shook off the chill, looked back down at my phone, and realized my character had died in the game while I was distracted. Annoyed, I waited for the respawn timer. Since the doctor was gone, I figured it was safe to bump the volume back up just a tiny bit. 2 or 3 notches on the volume rocker, just enough to hear the faint sound effects so I wouldn't get ambushed again. I got completely sucked back into the match. About 4 minutes later, the enemy team started invading my side of the map. In the heat of the moment, I completely forgot where I was. I practically yelled at my screen. I said something like, "Oh crap, they're stealing my jungle. Get down here and save me." The absolute exact second those words left my mouth, the footsteps returned, only this time, they were so much faster and almost aggressive with this rapid clack, 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 clack stopping right at my side. "Why are you still making so much noise in a hospital? Don't you care about your aunt at all?" I physically flinched. I looked up, my heart doing a nervous little skip, and it was the exact same female doctor with the short bob haircut and the round glasses. She looked genuinely upset this time. I felt terrible. I quickly pressed the power button on my phone, turning the screen completely black. I apologized profusely, saying I was just leaving and going back into the room. She just stood there, watching me in complete silence. I didn't wait to see her walk away this time. I grabbed my phone, stood up quickly, and ducked back into my aunt's room, gently shutting the door. And I actually remember seeing the victory screen pop up on my phone because we had just won the match right as the room went pitch black. I stood there for a second, letting my eyes adjust. From the darkness of the hospital bed, I heard my aunt's voice. She asked me in a groggy whisper who I was talking to out there. I walked over to my folding cot and sat down. I told her in a low voice that I was just playing a game and a doctor came by and scolded me for being too loud. My aunt let out a tired sigh. She told me to just turn the phone off and go to sleep, since it was already late anyway. I agreed, feeling pretty stupid for getting yelled at twice like a misbehaving child. I lay down on the squeaky canvas cot, pulled the thin hospital blanket up to my chest, and closed my eyes. I'm a pretty deep sleeper, but hospital rooms are never truly silent. There are always weird, structural creaks, the hum of machines, and nurses walking around outside. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. It felt like the dead of night, maybe 1:30 a.m. or 2 a.m. I woke up because someone was talking. It was my aunt. At first it was just soft, incoherent mumbling. I kept my eyes closed, figuring she was just having a weird dream caused by the pain medication. But then the mumbling turned into a very clear, distinct conversation. She was talking in her sleep, but she was responding to someone as if they were having a back and forth dialogue. I lay there in the dark, my ear pressed against the cheap pillow, listening to her side of the conversation. She was saying things like, "Yes, doctor, I'm just back here to get the metal plate removed." Then she paused for a few seconds, as if she was listening to a response. Then her tone shifted to something much more emotional. She sounded confused and heartbroken. She asked the air, "Why are you here? People told me you passed away. I missed you so much. Hearing the news made me so sad." My stomach instantly tied itself into a massive, heavy knot. A wave of ice-cold dread washed over my entire body. You have to understand, I was fully awake. This wasn't a dream. I could hear the hum of the AC. I could feel the rough texture of the blanket, and I could hear my aunt having a casual conversation with a dead person. I slowly, agonizingly opened my eyes. My folding cot was set up parallel to my aunt's hospital bed. There was exactly a 3-foot gap of empty floor space between the edge of my cot and the metal railing of her bed. Standing directly in the dead center of that tiny 3-foot gap, with her back facing me, was the doctor from the hallway. I stopped breathing, my brain completely short-circuited. It was the exact same woman, the same stark white pants, the same lab coat, the exact same short bob haircut resting just above her collar. She was standing close enough that I could have literally reached out and touched the fabric of her coat. One of her hands was gently holding my aunt's hand, resting on top of the blanket. Her other hand was slowly, rhythmically rubbing my aunt's shoulder in a soothing, comforting motion. It was the absolute textbook posture of a caring doctor doing a bedside checkup. But there was no sound. My aunt was lying there with her eyes completely shut, continuing her side of the conversation, answering questions that I couldn't hear. The entity standing right in front of me wasn't making a single audible noise. No breathing, no rustling of fabric as her hand moved. Just absolute, suffocating silence. That gut-wrenching, piss-your-pants kind of fear that hit me in that moment is almost impossible to describe in words. It's that feeling when your brain registers something so fundamentally wrong, so entirely against the laws of physics and reality, that your entire nervous system just screams at you to run. Fucking run. But my body was completely paralyzed. All I could do was stare wide-eyed at the back of this ghost's head. Suddenly, the survival instinct kicked in. I panicked, in a desperate attempt to break the tension, or maybe hoping that if I moved, she would turn around and just be a normal, living human doing late-night rounds. I violently shoved my blanket off and shot up into a sitting position on the cot. The exact millisecond I sat up, she vanished. There was no fading away, no cinematic smoke, just a silent, aggressive pop in reality, and the 3-foot space between the beds was completely empty. Less than half a second later, my aunt let out a sharp gasp and violently sat up in her bed. Her chest was heaving, and her eyes were wide open, darting around the dark room in absolute panic. She looked directly at me. I was sitting there, frozen, staring at the empty air. In a shaking voice, she asked me if I had just seen the doctor, standing right there. I could barely force the words out of my throat. I swallowed hard and told her yes. I told her the doctor was just standing there, and then completely disappeared into thin air. I admitted that I was terrified. I was an 18-year-old kid who had never believed in the paranormal, and my entire worldview had just been shattered in a matter of seconds. My aunt reached over and turned on the small bedside lamp. The harsh yellow light flooded the space, but it didn't make me feel any safer. She took a deep, shaky breath, leaned back against her pillows, and finally told me the truth. She explained that the doctor I had just described was the exact same woman who had taken care of her for 2 weeks after her horrible scooter crash earlier that year. Because my aunt was single and rarely had visitors besides my mom and me, she had felt incredibly isolated. That doctor had gone above and beyond her duties. She had bought my aunt meals out of her own pocket, sat by her bed to comfort her through the pain, and treated her like a sister. My aunt had grown deeply attached to her kindness. When my aunt had arrived at the hospital that afternoon to get her hardware removed, she had immediately asked the nursing staff if she could see that specific doctor to thank her again. The nurses had pulled her aside and broken the news. The incredibly kind, generous doctor had been battling a sudden, severe illness. She had passed away just a week ago, 5 or 7 days before we checked into that room. That was why my aunt was crying when I first arrived with her dinner. She had been mourning a woman she truly admired, keeping the grief locked inside her chest, like she always did. As my aunt explained this to me, the sheer gravity of what happened in the hallway finally crashed down on me. I realized with absolute certainty that the strict woman scolding me for being loud wasn't a cranky night shift worker, it was a lingering spirit. A ghost who was so dedicated to her patients, so protective of my aunt, that even in death, her soul was patrolling the corridors to make sure nobody disturbed her rest. That is why she felt like a walking block of ice. That is why she appeared in the physical world to discipline me and simultaneously manifested in my aunt's dreams to comfort her. My aunt tried to calm me down. She smiled weakly and told me not to be afraid. She said the doctor was a good person who loved her patients, and she was only scolding me because she cared. But knowing a ghost has good intentions does absolutely nothing to stop the raw physical reaction of pure panic. Anyway, after that whole thing happened, I was so freaked out that I literally pulled out my phone and played Catholic prayers on a loop just to make it through the rest of the night. I didn't sleep a single wink. I just sat up on that folding cot, clutching my phone, staring at the empty space between our beds, jumping at every tiny sound from the hallway. As soon as the sun came up the next morning, I packed my bag, bolted straight home, and absolutely refused to go back to that hospital to cover another night shift. My aunt ended up getting discharged about 2 days later without any issues. Once she was out and recovered, she actually managed to track down that late doctor's home address. She went over there personally to burn incense for her at her family altar, paying her final respects to a truly remarkable woman, since passing away in your 50s is just really tragically young.